All right, get ready to dive deep. We've got a ton to unpack on climate adaptation finance for agriculture. You've given us this fascinating USAID guidance document for donors and investors. Plus, we've got profiles of actual funds working in this space and even a peek into how they measure impact.
Yeah, it's quite a bit of material.
Our mission is to sift through it all.
Hmm.
We're going to find those golden nuggets you need if you're interested in this space. Like, think of it as this document being our treasure map.
I like that.
Okay, now here's the thing.
Right.
Everybody's talking about climate change, right? But adaptation, it's kind of the unsung hero. It only gets like 5% of total climate finance. So we're going to figure out where the real opportunities are and why more investment isn't pouring into adaptation.
Yeah, adaptation is often overlooked, you
Yeah.
know, and it's just as important as reducing emission.
Mitigation, right?
Exactly. And in agriculture, adaptation is super urgent.
Totally. Farmers are the ones dealing with these climate impacts day in and day out.
Exactly. And the USAID document really dives into how vulnerable smallholder farmers are, especially in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yet they don't always have the resources to adapt on their own.
Yep.
So there's huge need. But the document also says attracting investment for adaptation is tricky.
It's not as simple as, funding a solar farm or something.
Right. It's not just about renewable energy. It's about helping farmers cope with the impacts that are already happening.
Yeah, and adaptation projects, they're just inherently complex.
Like, why is that?
Because there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Climate impacts are different everywhere, and how you adapt, it varies from region to region.
It's almost like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle, where every piece is a totally different shape.
That's a great analogy. And on top of that, there's this perception that adaptation investments are riskier.
Which makes them, well, less attractive to your typical investor.
Exactly.
So how does this USAID guidance document try to tackle that problem and guide smart investments?
They've got 3 key criteria. 1, understand the local context. 2, base solutions on science. And 3, ensure intentionality and additionality.
Let's break those down. So starting with local context, they really emphasize that generic solutions are a no-go.
Oh yeah. What works in one place might totally backfire somewhere else.
Can you give me an example of that?
Sure. So solar pumps. They're fantastic for drought in the Sahel region, but if you plunk them down in, say, Bangladesh, where flooding is a huge problem, they could make things worse.
Makes sense. You can't just, like, copy and paste solutions across different regions.
Yep.
So how do you figure out what does work?
That's where the second criteria comes in grounding solutions in science. The USAID document points to some helpful tools like taxonomies.
Taxonomies.
Yeah, it sounds technical, but think of it this way. You're an investor, right? And you've got this stack of climate adaptation projects. A taxonomy helps you sort them. It's basically a way to categorize different types of solutions.
So it's like bringing order to the chaos.
Exactly. It's like having this detailed map of the adaptation landscape, And investors can quickly zero in on the right solutions for the problems they're trying to solve.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about intentionality and additionality? Those sound like jargony terms.
Yeah, they do, but they're super important to make sure investments are actually impactful.
So let's start with intentionality.
Intentionality means that climate adaptation is the main goal, not just a happy accident.
So you wouldn't want to fund a project that, like, maybe has a tiny adaptation component, but isn't truly designed for climate resilience.
Exactly. And the document suggests using the D2IC real markers to check this. It's basically a way to make sure adaptation is really the core objective of the investment.
I see. So it's about being laser focused on the intended outcome. What about additionality?
Okay, so additionality asks, is this investment really doing something extra? Is it going beyond what would have happened anyway? It's about making sure your money is making a real difference.
So it's not just doing something good, it's about doing something exceptional that wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Yes.
And the USAID's document actually highlights some funds that are putting these principles into practice, right?
Yes. And some of them are doing some really innovative stuff.
Okay, so let's get into those.
Okay, so the document highlights Sail Ventures and Green Fund, and also South Pole's Landscape Resilience Fund. They're doing something really interesting.
What's that?
Instead of picking projects and then, assessing the climate risk, they flip it.
Oh?
They start with climate risk assessments to find those areas that are most vulnerable.
Ah, so they're being proactive?
Exactly. They're figuring out the biggest gaps in adaptation, and then they find projects to fill them.
That's a cool approach. The document also talks about SP Ventures and IREM Invest as examples of funds that have very specific solutions they're looking for.
Right, so SP Ventures, they're all about biotech, digital agriculture services, and food tech.
So they've kind of narrowed it down.
Yeah, and then IREM Invest, they're really focused on water, like water resource management, sustainable agriculture practices.
More targeted approach.
It is. And this kind of brings up an interesting question about the trade-offs that funds have to make.
Like, what do you mean?
If you're super focused, you can really build deep expertise in that area, right? But you might miss out on other cool opportunities that are outside your scope.
Right, and if you're more flexible, you can be more adaptable, but then, like, keeping your portfolio cohesive and measuring impact might be harder.
Exactly. There's no right answer. It all depends on what the fund is trying to achieve and, the context.
For sure. The document also talks about how these funds measure the impact of their investments. They give examples of Catalyst Fund and Omnivore Partners Fund 3.
Yeah, and what's cool is that they show different ways to measure impact. Catalyst Fund focuses mostly on reach, like how many people are they reaching, how many businesses.
Like the number of people benefiting from the project.
Right. And they also use what are called proxy metrics. Those are kind of indirect indicators of adaptation.
Can you give an example?
Sure.
Yeah.
Like say you're tracking how many farmers are adopting drought-resistant crops, or if the amount of water used per hectare of land is going down, those kinds of things.
So it gives you an idea of whether things are moving in the right direction.
Exactly.
But it's not like you're directly measuring the impact of, say, climate change on yields, right?
Right. It's not that simple.
Okay, so what about Omnivore Partners? What's their approach?
They take it a step further. They're not just looking at reach and proxy metrics. They also try to measure how farmers feel about their ability to cope with climate risks. Like, have they gotten better at handling those risks thanks to the investment?
That's interesting.
Yeah, and they even look at what happens when actual climate shocks hit.
What do you mean by shocks?
Like a severe drought or a flood, They're trying to see how well the investments hold up under real-world conditions. It's the gold standard, but it's definitely not easy to do.
No, I can imagine. It's probably pretty resource-intensive to track all of that.
It is. Not every fund can pull it off, which is why it's so important for donors to support funds in building strong impact measurement systems.
So we've got the criteria for smart adaptation investments, and we've seen some examples of funds putting them into practice. But the big question is, where are the gaps? Where do we need that catalytic capital most?
Well, the USAID report highlights a few key areas, both in terms of specific solutions that need more funding and also some challenges at the fund level.
Okay, let's dive into that.
All right, so first, the report says that post-harvest management, precision agriculture, crop insurance, and midstream infrastructure are all kind of underfunded but really promising areas.
Let's start with post-harvest management. What does that even have to do with climate adaptation?
So it's all about reducing those losses after crops are harvested. Like having better storage facilities so grain doesn't spoil in hotter, more humid conditions.
Yeah.
Or better drying techniques to prevent mold, things like that.
Those sound pretty basic, but I guess it makes a big difference.
A huge difference, especially in developing countries where sometimes they're losing like 30% or more of their crops after harvest. Yeah, reducing those losses means more food on the table and more money for farmers.
So it's a win-win. What about precision agriculture? How does that fit into adaptation?
Okay, so precision ag is all about using technology to optimize farming practices. Like, think about soil sensors that tell you exactly when and where to irrigate. Or drones flying over your fields checking on crop health, or using data analytics to figure out the best crop varieties for your specific climate.
That sounds so high-tech.
It is, and it can really help farmers use resources more efficiently and make their operations more resilient to climate change.
But I imagine it can be expensive for smallholder farmers to adopt, right?
Yeah, that's a real barrier. There's a need for creative financing models, maybe even grants to help farmers afford this tech.
It's not just about developing the technology, it's about making it accessible. What about crop insurance? How does that play into this?
Traditional crop insurance, it's often not very helpful for smallholder farmers, especially with the crazy weather we're seeing these days.
Like it's too expensive or too complicated?
Yeah. The report says we need new models like index-based insurance. Have you heard of that?
Yeah. It's like instead of assessing individual losses, it pays out based on weather data, right?
Exactly. So if rainfall drops below a certain level, boom, the farmer gets a payout. It's much simpler and more transparent.
And it's more aligned with the realities of climate change.
Yes. And lastly, the report talks about midstream infrastructure.
What's that?
It's all those facilities and systems that connect farms to markets, like cold storage to prevent spoilage in the heat, efficient transportation networks, processing plants,
So investing in this would help everybody along the value chain.
Exactly. It benefits the whole system.
Okay, so those are 4 areas where investment is really needed. But the report also talks about some challenges that funds are facing, right?
Yes, it's not just about finding the right solutions. There are some systemic barriers that make adaptation finance kind of tricky.
Like what?
Well, like we talked about before, these investments are often seen as high risk. They're long-term, and the deal sizes are relatively small.
That doesn't sound super appealing to your typical investor, does it?
No. Investors usually want quicker returns and predictable outcomes,
So how do we bridge that gap?
That's where donors and philanthropic organizations come in. They can provide that initial catalytic capital to make these investments less risky and more attractive to private investors.
So it's about using grant funding or maybe guarantees or concessional loans to de-risk those investments.
Exactly. And it's not just about throwing money at the problem either.
Oh.
The USAID document really emphasizes this idea of a systems approach. Like, it's not enough to just fund one piece of the puzzle. You have to think about the whole agricultural ecosystem.
Okay, I'm not totally sure what you mean.
So imagine you invest in drought-resistant seeds, right? But the farmers don't know how to use them properly, or they don't have the right equipment.
So it's a waste.
Exactly. So a systems approach means you're investing in training, knowledge sharing, promoting things like regenerative agriculture, building long-term resilience, not just responding to individual shocks.
It's a much more holistic approach.
Exactly. And donors can play a big role in, funding research, pilot projects, and building capacity.
But donors have to make some tough choices, right? There are trade-offs.
Oh, for sure. The USISC document lays out some of those trade-offs.
Give me an example.
Okay, so do you fund cutting-edge, innovative solutions? Those might be smaller in scale at first. Or do you go for stuff that's already proven and can be scaled up quickly?
Right. And do you focus on most vulnerable populations? Or do you try to reach a wider audience?
Exactly. These are tough calls. It's all about finding the right balance between innovation and scalability. Reaching the most vulnerable versus reaching more people.
It's about making strategic choices with limited resources.
Yes.
And that brings us to another really important point that the document brings up. How do we actually measure whether these investments are making a difference?
Yeah, how do we know if it's working?
Exactly. The document lays out a framework for measuring impact, right?
Yes. And it includes those 4 areas we talked about before: reach, proxy metrics, perceived adaptation, and the results of actual shocks.
Right. We touched on those earlier, but maybe we can dive a little deeper.
Yeah, so reach is pretty straightforward. It's just counting how many people or businesses are being impacted by a project.
So like the number of farmers trained or the hectares of land under improved practices?
Exactly, but it doesn't tell you if those changes are actually leading to more climate resilience, does it?
Right. It's just about the scale of the project.
Right. That's where proxy metrics come in. They're things that are easier to measure than the ultimate outcomes.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. So instead of trying to measure the exact impact of climate change on crop yields, you might look at changes in water use efficiency or soil health.
Okay, so it's like you're looking at the building blocks of resilience.
Yes.
Yeah.
But they're still just proxies. They don't tell the whole story.
Which is why the document also talks about measuring perceived adaptation.
Right. And that's all about how farmers feel about their ability to deal with climate risks. Have they noticed any improvements? Do they feel more prepared?
You're trying to capture their experience.
Exactly. You usually get this kind of info through surveys and interviews.
But that can be subjective, right? People's perceptions aren't always accurate.
True. That's why you have to look at it alongside other data. And ideally, you also want to measure the results of actual shocks.
So you see how well the investment performs when, a real drought hits.
Exactly. That's the most direct way to know if it's working, but it's also the most difficult to measure.
Right. You need a lot of data, and it takes time to collect it.
Yep. So there's this trade-off between, having a super comprehensive measurement system and actually being able to do it.
And again, this is where donors can play a role.
Absolutely. Donors can help funds build the capacity to measure impact properly. Because if you can't measure it, you can't really manage it, right?
Makes sense. We've talked a lot about the big picture.
Yeah.
But I'm always curious about what adaptation looks like on the ground. like for actual farmers.
Me too.
Do you have any examples?
Yeah. Yeah, the USAID document actually has a really cool case study from Kenya. They're facing some serious drought issues there,
Right.
And it profiles this initiative called Water Banking and Drought Mitigation. It's run by a local NGO.
Water banking.
Yeah. It's kind of like creating a savings account for water,
Okay.
During the rainy season, they capture rainwater runoff. They use these structures like sand dams and subsurface dams.
So they're storing it underground.
Exactly. That way it doesn't evaporate. And then during the dry season, farmers can use this water to irrigate their crops.
Oh, I see.
They actually use solar-powered pumps to get the water out. It's a really neat blend of traditional knowledge and modern tech.
It sounds pretty sustainable.
It is, and it's not just about providing water either. The NGO also trains farmers on how to use water more efficiently, and they teach them about drought-tolerant crops and stuff.
So it's really building resilience.
Yes. And the document says the project has led to, more food security for the families involved, and they're even making more money because they can sell their surplus.
That's great. I love those kind of tangible examples.
Mm-hmm.
What about other regions? Like what's happening in India with those increasingly unpredictable monsoons?
Well, one solution that's gaining traction there is weather-based index insurance.
Oh, yeah, we talked about that a bit earlier.
Right. But it's worth, digging into a little more.
So just remind me, how does that work?
Basically, a farmer buys an insurance policy, and if the rainfall drops below a certain level, they get a payout.
Automatically.
Yeah. It's all triggered by data from weather stations, no need for complicated assessments of crop losses or anything.
It's so much easier for farmers, right?
Yeah.
Especially smallholders.
Exactly, and it makes a lot of sense in areas where the weather's becoming more erratic.
So these examples from Kenya and India, they really show how much innovation's happening on the ground,
Yeah.
It's not all doom and gloom.
It's not, and technology is playing a huge role.
Let's talk about that. What are some of the coolest ways tech is being used to help farmers adapt?
Well, we're seeing a lot of digital tools popping up, like mobile apps that give farmers real-time weather forecasts or alerts about pests and diseases.
Okay.
And they can even connect farmers to markets so they can get better prices for their products.
So it's like empowering them with information and connections.
Exactly. And then there's remote sensing, satellites and drones that can monitor drought conditions and crop health.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It's like having a bird's eye view of the farm. And then all that data can be analyzed to give farmers really specific recommendations.
It's like taking the guesswork out of farming in a changing climate.
It is. And on top of that, there's agricultural biotechnology. Scientists are developing crops that are more resilient to drought, floods, heat stress. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it sounds almost like science fiction.
It does. But it's really important for food security, as the planet keeps warming.
Totally. But access to technology is a big issue, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. We can't let tech become this luxury that only certain farmers can afford.
So how do we bridge that gap?
Well, we need targeted investments, programs that specifically help smallholder farmers adopt these technologies.
And training?
Yes, training is huge.
So it's not just about the tech itself, it's about making sure people can use it effectively.
Exactly. And tech isn't just helping farmers adapt, it's also changing how adaptation finance is happening.
How so?
There are these online platforms popping up that connect investors with projects. It's making the whole process way more transparent and efficient.
So tech is kind of streamlining everything.
It is.
I'm glad to hear that. As we wrap up, I keep thinking about the USAID document's focus on partnerships. It's so clear that we need everyone working together on this, right?
Oh, absolutely. Governments, businesses, NGOs, researchers, farmers themselves, everyone needs a seat at the table.
What are the keys to a successful partnership in this space?
First off, everyone needs to agree on what they're trying to achieve. What's the vision? How are we going to work together?
So you have to be on the same page.
Yes. And communication is key. Everyone has to be open and honest, share information, be willing to listen and adapt.
Because the situation's always changing.
It is. And one of the biggest challenges for partnerships is power imbalances.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Imagine a partnership between a huge multinational corporation and a small farmer organization. Making sure everyone has an equal voice. That can be tricky.
It's about making sure everyone feels respected and heard.
Exactly. And then there's the whole logistical side of things, coordinating activities, managing money, communicating across different languages and cultures.
Yeah. That can be a lot to juggle.
It can. Building trust and strong relationships is just as important as the technical stuff.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, what are the key messages you want to leave our listeners with?
Well, first off, climate change is already impacting agriculture globally, and it's only going to get more intense.
This isn't some far-off problem, it's happening now.
Yes. Second, adaptation is not a choice, it's a necessity. It's about protecting livelihoods, ensuring food security, and building a more stable future.
It's about survival, really.
It is. And third, even though the challenges are big, there's reason to be hopeful.
Okay, good.
There are innovative solutions out there, technology is helping, and there are people who are deeply passionate about this work.
But it's going to take a concerted effort, right?
Absolutely. We need governments to step up, we need businesses to invest, and we need individuals to get involved.
So, dear listener, as you continue exploring this world, remember that you have a role to play.
Yes.
Support businesses that are prioritizing climate adaptation. Talk to your elected officials. And push for policies that create a more resilient and sustainable food system for all.
It's a team effort.
That's right. And that concludes our deep dive into climate adaptation finance for agriculture.
Thanks for joining us. We hope you learned something.
We sure did, and we hope you feel inspired to take action. Until next time, stay curious and stay engaged.